wherever you sit there, Sam. Lovely to see you both. Thank you for joining us. So we've had the scientists, obviously, talking about where we are and where we're potentially going, and both of them saying, as everyone here today is saying, that innovation is absolutely going to be key to changing the destiny. So Sarah, 10 years to change the system, can we do it?
Yes, I think you have to believe we can. I'm an eternal optimist, but I think there's lots of evidence out there that suggests change is possible in relatively short periods of time. And we've seen it already. I mean, I think, for example, Norway, what they did with electric vehicles, in 2014, they decided now's the time to stimulate the uptake of electric vehicles. And that was a government decision. And through a wide range of financial incentives, I think last year, 2/3 of their vehicles sold were electric vehicles. They've got more electric vehicles per capita than any other country in the world. So it's totally, that's in under 10 years, So I think if we apply that kind of mindset, it's totally possible.
Ravi, what are the bold ideas that are already out there and that are coming through?
Well, I think first I just want to say, on this note of optimism, when I was introducing the Climate Change Act in 2006, we actually set a goal at that time to reduce emissions by 60% by 2050. And there was everyone saying it's impossible. And we're now already 50% down on 1990 levels. So that's one moment where I think we've been totally surprised by the degree of progress. Similarly, when the European Union set a target to increase renewables, and we signed up to 30% of our electricity being renewable by 2020, everybody thought that was impossible. Nobody in the whole of the Department for Energy thought this was anything other than ludicrous, and we actually overachieved the target. So I think history suggests, even recent history, that we can go faster than we might suggest. So what's exciting, I think, is the progress on renewables and solar and offshore wind, EVs. Both of those technologies have gone further and faster than we probably thought. They're coming down the cost curve faster. I think the area that's most in the balance is the transformation of homes. And that's one which is more complicated, but I think there is actually lots of excitement under the surface that is ready to come out in the next few years.
And on the transformation of homes, I mean, when you say that when you look back, there are areas which have changed more quickly than seemed possible, it does seem that homes are an area where things are really lagging. I mean, heat pumps, for example.
Yeah.
Where are we with that?
So yeah, we only do 30,000 heat pumps a year today. We've got to get to 10 times that by 2028. And then we've got to double that again by the mid-2030s. So it's a huge acceleration. There are countries that have done it. So if you look at Finland, 15% of their energy comes from heat pumps. They've really accelerated. Similarly, several other countries. The way it happens is a combination of both government regulation and driving it, providing the clarity that industry needs to invest. Because the only way this changes is if people train to become heat engineers, people invest, companies start pushing it. And then the other part of it is the consumer demand. So what happened with EVs was that it became an aspirational, attractive thing, and that's what kick-started the confidence in the industry. And we have to pivot that on the heat pump side. One of the things that is in the Nesta family is the behavioral insights team, and really understanding human behavior and what people aspire to, how you make things easy and intuitive, I think is going to be critical to accelerating the transition on homes.
Good to talk more about behavioral insights and the sort of social tipping points and how you take people with you at pace. So we'll definitely come back to that. But just picking up, Sarah, on what Ravi was saying. Sorry, I don't know if you're all hearing something I'm hearing too. I hope you can still hear us clearly. What Ravi was saying about governments needing to be joined up. Is government here joined up enough in terms of getting fully behind the technologies that need to be pushed out at scale?
No, I don't think they are, and I don't think there's much evidence to counter that right now. I also think government can be much more imaginative, certainly this government can be much more imaginative, about the kind of tools they have at their disposal to do that kind of investment and behavioural shift. If you look at the incentives being put behind decarbonising homes, they haven't been massively successful. but they haven't really utilized other things like procurement. You know, government is the purchase. I think government in this country is the largest purchaser of housing. You know, there are enormous amounts of money already being spent by the government on things that need to be decarbonized. So doing what Germany did, for example, and providing pre-market commitments to the solar industry was really the sort of the big change in the general global solar markets. So this government could be much more creative on things like procurement. They could be much more creative on things like planning. I just don't think they're prepared to take the political hits.
How important is getting the housing situation right in this context?
It's incredibly important. I mean, you know, this country is slightly different to others in that we have a very, very large old housing stock that needs to be better insulated and retrofitted. And I think one of the Nesta investments actually is in some refurbishment innovation. But actually, we're building new houses all the time, and we need to have zero carbon cement, zero carbon steel. And these things are being done. Like, there are companies already producing zero carbon steel, admittedly expensively. But again, government could provide the kind of pre-market purchasing that would give those companies the confidence to grow their production and actually therefore reduce costs. So I think the role of government in being that sort of early purchaser, large purchaser that enables companies to scale out their production facilities has not been utilized.
When it's left to the market and to social behavior, obviously, you know, that's an area where massive change can happen. But at a time, I suppose, of, you know, a lot of belt tightening, cost of living crisis, these things become expensive extras, effectively, that people would look at. And unless there's, I suppose, government policy behind things and financial incentives, how much does that get in the way?
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that there's huge savings to be made if you insert a smart heating control or if you do cavity and loft insulation, but people have just not taken them up over the last 10 years. In the last year, we've seen more progress. We've seen people, because price increases have been so salient, we've seen people doing more. But if you really want to get to the full benefit of that, I think we've got to be massively more bold, and it's got to be radically simpler for a consumer to do this. You've got to pay nothing up front. You've got to have somebody doing this for you in a very seamless, trusted way. There's, at the moment, far too much hassle, risk, uncertainty to get the scale and pace of home retrofit that we need and would hugely benefit from, because this actually would massively save consumers money. It would insulate the whole economy from the volatility that we've faced in recent years. It's a real no-brainer, and it does require more government leadership than we've had.
If you've got questions that you want me to put to Sarah and Ravi, please just go on the QR code there on the wall and you can enter questions, and I've got the system here so I can filter your questions through. They'd be very welcome if you want to join in. So talking more then about the behavioral insights that you're picking up through the work that you're doing, Ravi, tell us a bit more about that.
You know, a lot of this is not rocket science. So if you take even financial incentives, historically we had this thing called the renewable heat incentive, which gives people a long-term revenue stream over many, many years. But we know that humans discount future benefits hugely. So having an upfront discount, as we've now got, I think is much more attractive. We've trialed at the Behavioural Insights teams different packages of support. So what happens when you say an interest-free loan? What happens if that's government-backed? And what's the differential take-up? And it's clear that those sorts of things which are, you know, interest-free loans, government-backed, have a massively more positive effect than if they're purely commercial or if they're framed in different ways. So we have to really redesign this whole customer experience from the user's perspective. And, you know, for instance, another example is, think about where people get their advice. When you have the boiler engineer come into your home and they say, oh, I'm not sure your home would really work for a heat pump, that's a massively damaging bit of advertising for this whole sector. And often it's based on myth. So one of the things we were talking about was how can we get that army of plumbers and boiler engineers to become the best advocates for heat pumps? So why don't we get them to be the first adopters of heat pumps? You know, we could subsidize the grants that we're providing, the subsidies. We should get them to be the first cohort, and then they can be the sort of people who provide the better information to consumers. So thinking a bit more creatively about how you spread the social norm and get people to be aware of what the potential is for these new technologies, I think is the first challenge.
As you say, that's not rocket science and that's pretty cheap to do, but is it happening?
But actually, just to build on that, I think if we take a look at sort of the climate change movement over the
Yeah.
last 20 years, until relatively recently, it was dominated by NGOs and campaigners who were sort of trying to advocate to the world that disaster was looming, and the sort of insertion of the private sector into the debate has been relatively recent. And I think it brings with it a lot more sort of, practical awareness of like, this is a consumer exercise, how to market to people, how to get people to buy things, how to get people to change their behavior. That is just something the private sector excels at in a way that the not-for-profit and the NGO world doesn't. And so I think it's, to the sort of the people who are concerned about probably not in this room, concerned about the role capitalism has to play in the climate change movement. I actually think it's incredibly advantageous to bring that mindset.
I mean, just building on that, one question I think we've got to ask is, are we expecting consumers to do one-off changes, like buy a heat pump or buy an EV, or ongoing daily changes, such as turning down your thermostat, switching off your appliances because there's a peak in demand? That latter ongoing behavior change is really, really difficult to get people to do. So I think the future probably lies in intermediaries like energy companies being the organization that optimizes energy on behalf of the consumer and captures the benefits that are substantial in flattening demand. Now, that emergence of energy service companies has been talked about for years, but we need the regulatory framework that shifts the business models of these energy companies. At the moment, though, energy companies make money largely through consumers' inertia. They don't switch, and therefore prices can go up, and that's how they make money, by selling more stuff. What we need, I think, in the future is energy companies making money out of flattening demand. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that, we probably need to double electricity capacity in this country. If you can be smart about the demand management, you can really significantly reduce the amount of electricity capacity we build. But we need to structure the incentives in the market so that companies can benefit from that and make money out of it.
Question from the audience. How much of government foot dragging is due to lobbying and donations from legacy industries?
Do in this country, I don't think it's that much. Again, I'm an optimist. I've worked in policy across many different countries, in many different sectors, and it doesn't feel to me, and it doesn't seem to me, that in this country, indeed the European Union broadly, that big-scale lobbying by oil and gas is the problem that we're trying to overcome. I think that's not necessarily true in the US. I think in the US there is much more of a pay-to-play, financial incentives, particularly on the right, to prevent new legislation being passed. That said, I mean, the US has done the most extraordinary amount of legislation in the last 3 years, not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act, which together are the biggest signal yet that government can and will support the growth of new technology and climate reduction. It's incredibly radical. I mean, if anyone's paid attention to the detail of the Inflation Reduction Act, it's incredibly radical about the kind of technologies they're prepared to fund, the ways they're prepared to fund it, the ways they're trying to shape the companies, investing in local communities, investing in local workers. I mean, it's I think, a rather brilliant piece of legislation, and it has cross-party support. So, if any country is still feeling a little nervous about climate and how to sort of put their weight behind the changes that are needed, the Inflation Reduction Act is a great case study.
I mean, the one area where I think there has been some damage, I would say, is in relation to hydrogen lobbying to do with home heating. Mm-hmm. It's just really, really important that government decides what the direction of travel is. So if you look at EVs or offshore wind, once it became inevitable that we were going full steam for EVs, not hydrogen fuel cells, mm-hmm. once it became inevitable that on and offshore wind and solar was cost competitive, the money, the training, the investment all flowed in. As long as we're in this sort of hedging, it's quite hard to go fast. And you can't go too soon. You've got to have a bit of a technology race to try and discover what's best. But at some point, you've just got to have a clear direction of travel. And at the moment, I would say that there is a lot of lobbying on the hydrogen side to say, let's pipe gas into people's homes that's hydrogen. And you know, for both cost reasons and the fact that hydrogen is in fact a greenhouse gas and is very, very leaky, I just don't think it's going to be ever competitive with electrification.
I agree with that. I agree that it's not the right technology to heat homes. However, I'm not sure it's just about lobbying. I think part of the problem from a government perspective is you only know what you're told, right? You are a minister, you're a department, you get lots of people giving you information. And until there are really strong, well-funded, vociferous advocates for alternative innovations, all they're hearing is, you know, the various energy producers who are already got corporate lobbyists on their staff. So I think there's a real opportunity and a gap that's not being filled right now for early stage innovators to club together and to become a sort of single voice to government to say, look, you may be told that hydrogen is the answer for home heating, but actually, have you looked at ground source heat pumps? Here's what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Have you looked at green gas energy from grass? Here's what we're doing. There's lots of alternatives out there, but they're just not as well advocated for.
And I think where it comes in really handy is if you can think about those new technologies and the new business models, they need to have a really productive conversation with regulators, because often the current regulations are stacked in favor of the incumbents. And what you need is regulation that opens up to new entrants and new business models. There's a sort of saying that what happens in a sandbox stays in a sandbox. So regulation that just creates a little artificial playpen often doesn't change the whole system. And I think we have to get better at regulation being sort of forward-looking, anticipatory, to enable, you know, new models that are coming through to go faster.
You mentioned green gas coming from grass. We're actually going to be speaking later in the day to Dale Vince, who's the founder of Ecotricity, who is working in that space also. And it's not something that's kind of widely talked about, widely known. Obviously, as time goes on, new innovations come through, and you're talking there about the race to see which is the best innovation that gets policymakers behind it, funding behind it. When things are constantly evolving, it's a difficult game, isn't it?
I think it's difficult for government to know where to put their efforts, but I think we need all of these innovations to be worked on. I don't support the view that we have the innovations we need, we just need to build it. I think we do have things that are on the table that could create a 100% renewable grid and could decarbonise transport and could decarbonise summer food, but we don't have the whole menu of things. And for as long as there's only one solution, the costs remain high. What you want to do is spread your bets. What you want to do is have a portfolio of different things that innovators are working on that enables us to sort of trial all the different methodologies and to bring the cost down. I mean, I was working until very recently at a bit of Google called X, and we work on lots of new technologies. And there I was really astounded by the number of different technologies that are still in the early stages that could be really transformative. So, for example, applying CRISPR, the technology that we use to develop the vaccines, to plants to enable them to have deeper roots that in turn would enable them to absorb more carbon. So, you know, genetic adjustments, not genetic modification in the GMO sense, but genetic adjustments to roots that enables us to sequester more carbon in the soil. Now, that is not part of anyone's, you know, roadmap to net zero at the moment, but if it works, it could make a massive difference. Those sort of things, we shouldn't shut the door to them. We need to keep on innovating so that actually, as we get to the next stage of net zero evolution, we can apply these things because they'll be more mature and they'll have figured out what works.
Well, we know, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and things can be done incredibly quickly when the time frame is short. So is the time frame getting shorter almost being a good thing in terms of the innovation and how creative and open mind, how much minds are opening up?
I mean, it focuses the mind of maybe some of the more slow corporates and governments who have sort of slightly back-ended this problem as someone else's. You know, I think one of the things I came to realize at X is that you can have amazing technologies, but really they will stay on the shelf unless someone adopts them. right? So actually the job isn't just the scientists and working in the lab, it's about persuading corporates or consumers to adopt your technology into their supply chain. And that is a whole other range of problem solving. And, you know, guess what? Scientists and innovators are often not the best people to persuade other people to do things. But that is the sort of the effort you need. You have to persuade, you know, enormous companies like, you know, the chemical producers to utilize your technology somewhere in this. That's a hard human-centric job. So it's not just about the innovation, it's actually about getting out into the world and doing this sort of work with other organizations.
I mean, if you look at most technology transitions and the S-curves, it often takes decades for something that's clearly better than the alternative to percolate through the whole system. Now, we haven't got time to have that normal trajectory. We have to really scrunch the S-curve, and that's difficult because it involves lots of coordination. It involves infrastructure to be built to enable more electricity capacity or more heat pumps or more EVs. It requires people to retrain in huge numbers to be able to do this stuff. It requires consumers to suddenly potentially make changes and different purchasing decisions. So for me, the challenge of doing it quickly is this coordination issue, which normally happens over time, and that's why big technology transitions take decades. So it is challenging, but it requires leadership by industry and government and probably engaging with each other more about what they need to go faster.
Question for you, Ravi, from the audience. Do you see different behavioral insights based on age or generation? And is there a way to appeal to everyone with sustainable messaging?
Well, one of the big shifts in behavioral insights at the moment is what's called precision nudging. So instead of assuming that everybody responds to the same kind of message, we need to tailor the message to those individuals. And you can now do that in a more data-driven way with lots of A/B testing and experiments. So I think you do see, typically in all behavioral experiments, quite a lot of heterogeneity. And now I think it is possible to do some tailoring. I think that one question is the degree of hassle and consumer burden that you're placing on people. And we know that obviously for older people, placing that sort of consumer burden, but frankly for lots of people, it's going to be very difficult. So making it as simple and easy as possible is just crucial.
Another question from the audience, and it actually goes back to what we were talking about with buildings, but we were talking primarily about domestic buildings. This one is, there are 2 million non-domestic buildings in the UK. How can they be incentivized to electrify and decarbonize heating and cooling at scale?
Oh, that's quite a big question. I don't know enough about those commercial buildings. I think there's a question about, you know, is it sort of owned by a small number of players, and actually is it possible to have a kind of coordinated effect or not? Actually, just going back to what Ravi was saying, I do think if anyone here is working in the sort of new innovation space, I really encourage you to all think more about experimentation. You know, the sort of methodology of experimentation in small, scrappy ways is the quickest way to figure out, you know, what's the best marketing message? Is this the right market I'm selling into? Like, how do I discover really quickly the path from where I am now to scale? And the quicker you can experiment at the cheapest cost, the less time you're going to waste in pursuing paths that are pointless.
So that's a really interesting point, because I mean, going back to what you were saying before about all these incredible innovations that you're seeing, and that some of them might just sit on the shelf if they don't find that way to cut through. What would your advice be to someone in this room who's thinking, I have got these great ideas, and
Well,
it's
so
hard to get it
Get
scaled up?
out of the lab as soon as you can. Like I work with various organizations who are doing a lot of sort of R&D within laboratories or within sort of corporate scientific labs. And they have these most amazing sort of experiments in controlled circumstances. Or they write really great theoretical business plans and strategies. And as soon as they get into the real world, whether it be working with a partner or trying their business for real, all those plans go out the window. You learn so much more in actually doing it. So I would spend less time planning and more time doing, but the doing in an experimental format. Don't commit a ton of money. Don't set out 3-year plans. Do 6-month experiments and then iterate. Don't waste your money until you really know that you've got something that works.
I want to wrap up by giving you each a magic wand, and you can, wave it wherever you like. You can have as many wishes as you like in terms of what you see as the way to make the difference, where you think the investment should be in innovation. What are the innovations that are going to make the change?
Oh, big pressure. I would have more innovation in government policy. I think that is where we are right now. We've got, thankfully, a ton of investors looking at early stage technology innovation. We've got a ton of great universities and technologists working on those breakthroughs. And we've got a lot of very cheap, actually, ready to go solar and wind to put on the grid. So I actually think the tools are in the right place and people are putting money into the right things. What we're missing is really creative, bold policy making that could, as Ravi says, be the thing that really sort of shakes up the system and squashes this S-curve. So I would say a government that is really radical about procurement, creates a sort of big pot of procurement money that's targeted at the early stage new innovators, not just the big corporates. A government that changes up the planning system and says, we guarantee we'll get your onshore wind, approval within 6 weeks. And crucially, communities having incentives or ways to be rewarded for the local energy that's being built in their community. I think that kind of policy package, this country could be brilliant at this. I have to say, I think we're very good at being down on ourselves, and maybe with good reason over the last few years. But I do think this country is small enough, but rich enough and innovative enough to truly be a world leader in getting to net zero quickly with innovation, and therefore be a world leader in terms of selling these products globally. But I do think it needs the government to take a much more bold leadership role.
Thank you.
So I picked 3 things. I mean, firstly, we are trying to electrify the whole economy. And yet at the moment, electricity is made more expensive than gas because it's got a carbon tax on, whereas gas doesn't, and we've got our energy levies on it. So we need to get electricity prices down, and the ratio between electricity to gas, we think, needs to be about 2.5 to 1, rather than 3, 4, 5 to 1, as it has been historically. So that's the first thing. If we want to electrify the economy, we need to make electricity cheaper. Secondly, we need to have very, very clear regulation on lowering the carbon emissions from homes by 2035. We would have never made the progress on EVs without vehicle emission standards at EU level. We would have never made the progress on renewable electricity without very, very clear regulation at the EU level. We need something similar on homes, otherwise we won't get that clarity to accelerate investment. And then the third thing is, I think we need our energy companies to totally shift their business model. They need to be helping consumers lower their energy use and flatten their energy demand. That's where we need them to make money. And we need to structure the market, the retail energy market, so that that's how energy companies' dominant business model is, rather than the current one.
Thank you both so much. It's been great to hear your thoughts. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.